уважаемые члены диссертационного совета
Dear council
и
members
те, кто с нами в прямом эфире.
and all the attendees,
Позвольте считать открытым заседание
declare our
диссертационного
session of the
совета
dissertation
по
council
защите
for
диссертации
the
Натальи
defense of
Сергеевны
the
Васильевой на
Validity
соискание ученой
Sergeevna
степени
for the degree
кандидата
of candidate
юридических
of legal
наук по
sciences,
специальности
academic specialization 120001, Theory and History of Law and State. Let's
начать. Так, глубоко уважаемые члены диссертационного совета и все, кто с нами сейчас на связи, позвольте считать открытым заседание диссертационного совета по защите диссертации Натальи Сергеевны Васильевой на соискание ученой степени кандидата юридических наук по специальности 12.00.1 «Теория, история права и государства, история учения о праве и государстве» на тему «Проблема действительности права в правовой концепции Альфа-Росса». Приказом Санкт-Петербургского государственного университета от 13 февраля 2020 года я, Луковская, Женевра, Игоревна, доктор юридических наук, профессор кафедры теории, истории и государственного права, назначена председателем данного диссертационного совета. И этим же приказом утверждены члены диссертационного совета. Мы работаем тоже в соответствии с приказом СПбГУ в режиме удаленного доступа. Разрешите представить вам членов диссертационного совета. Игорь Юрьевич Козлихин со временем появится, он с нами. Валентина Викторовна Лопаева, доктор юридических наук, главный научный сотрудник сектора философии, истории и теории государства и права Института государства и права Российской академии наук. Валентина Викторовна, вы слышите, видите? Спасибо, я тоже рада. Илья Львович Чеснов, доктор юридических наук, профессор кафедры теории, истории государства и права Санкт-Петербургского юридического института, филиала Университета прокуратуры Российской Федерации. Илья Львович, слышите ли вы нас и видите ли? Еще раз здравствуйте. Спасибо. Алексей Вячеславович Стовба, доктор юридических наук, проректор по вопросам научно-методической работы Харьковского института кадров управления. Алексей Вячеславович, слышите ли вы нас? Видите? Сергей Федорович Ударцев, доктор law, professor, head of research projects on legal policy, constitutional legislation, and public administration at Нарибаев University. Университета Казахского государственного юридического университета имени Нарибаева. Видите ли вы нас и слышите? Can you see us? Can you hear us? Спасибо. На связи с нами находится также научный руководитель соискателя Тимошина Елена Владимировна, доктор юридических наук, профессор кафедры теории, истории государства и права. Елена Владимировна, слышите ли вы
Елена Владимировна, can you hear us? Yes, good afternoon, Zenevra Igorevna. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I can hear you.
Спасибо.
And hope you can see
Будем
me.
считать, что все члены
So
диссертационного
let's
совета,
assume all
а
the members
также
of the
и
dissertation council,
соискатель на
the
связи, и
degree
научный
applicants
руководитель, мы все
online,
видим
and
и
the
слышим друг
academic advisor,
друга.
and we can all see and hear.
Коллеги, наше заседание
Dear
проводится в
colleagues,
режиме
please our
удаленного
meeting
доступа,
held
поэтому прошу
now.
всех следить,
So
тщательно
I
следить за процедурой. И в
to
случае,
follow
если произойдет технический
and in
сбой,
case there's a technical
то есть
failure
кого-то мы перестаем видеть или
and
слышать, прошу
stop seeing,
сообщать
hearing
мне об
sound,
этом.
please inform
Я
me.
должна буду объявить
I will have
технический
to
перерыв для
technical
устранения этих неполадок.
to
На
eliminate.
случай,
In
если
case
прервется связь со мной,
connect
тогда
me,
заявление о
I
техническом перерыве огласит Сергей Федорович Ударцев. Сергей Федорович, вы
to call a
согласны?
technical break. Sergei Fedorovich, do you agree?
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Вы не возражаете, уважаемые члены
Do you
Совета?
mind, dear council members? No, we don't.
Спасибо. Тогда продолжаем.
Then let's continue.
И прошу вас для улучшения качества связи,
group,
уважаемые коллеги,
Dear
выключать
colleagues,
свои микрофоны.
turn off the
Но
microphone.
только не забывайте их снова включать,
Remember
когда
to
вам
turn
будет
them
предоставлено
on. You
слово.
are given the floor.
Сообщаю также, что
Let me also
видеозапись ведется, аудио-видеозапись нашего заседания и прямая трансляция на сайте СПбГУ ведется, осуществляется синхронный перевод выступлений с русского на английский язык. И далее. На странице соискателя в данное время размещен адрес электронной почты, по которому в течение заседания все участники прямой трансляции заседания диссертационного совета могут высказать свое мнение, направить вопросы соискателю, естественно, онлайн, касающиеся его диссертации, текущего научного обсуждения его выступления. Эти вопросы техническими службами будут направлены мне. Я их оглашу во время дискуссии или попрошу это сделать куратора защиты, сотрудника отдела по обеспечению деятельности диссертационных советов Людмилу Ларису Викторовну Хрущеву. Ну или кого-либо из членов совета, если будут на иностранных языках эти вопросы. Вопросы должны иметь отношение к выступлению соискателя и содержанию его диссертации, обязательно содержать указания на фамилию, имя, отчество, должности, место работы автора этого вопроса. Вопросы, не имеющие отношения к научной дискуссии, к обсуждению диссертации, к тексту диссертации, оценке диссертации, оглашаться не будут. В соответствии продолжим. С приказом присуждения в Санкт-Петербургском государственном университете ученой степени кандидата наук, ученой степени доктора, утвержденным локальными нормативными актами СПбГУ, заседание диссертационного совета считается правомочным, если в его работе принимает участие не менее 2/3 от утвержденного состава диссертационного совета, но не менее 4 человек. Наш диссертационный совет состоит из 6 человек. Присутствуют, будем считать, все 6. Все в удаленном интерактивном режиме.
Ginevra Igorevna, I beg your pardon. Not all 6 are present. Igor Yurievich has not joined us yet. Okay, let's assume he will join us shortly, but at the moment, thank you for this direction. 5 out of 6 members are present, all in the remote interactive mode. Audio-visual contact has been established to all of them.
Соответствующий контакт. И таким образом кворум есть. Поручаю куратору защиты Ларисе Викторовне оформить явочный лист, в котором перечислить присутствующих членов диссертационного совета и указать их режим работы, в данном случае удаленный. Я должна далее установить регламент сегодняшнего заседания диссертационного совета, который продолжительностью ориентировочно 2 часа. Я не знаю, превышу ли я свои полномочия, если сошлюсь на то, что у всех членов совета есть этот регламент. И если члены совета не возражают, то не буду его оглашать. Если коллеги не возражают, нет возражений? Спасибо. Если возражений нет, то перехожу к реализации регламента заседания. Но прошу прежде всего отключить звук у мобильных телефонов. И за это благодарю. Итак, приступаю к ведению заседания. Слово предоставляется научному руководителю Наталье Сергеевне Васильевой, доктору юридических наук, профессору кафедры теории истории государственного права и СПБГУ Елене Владимировне Тимошиной. Елена Владимировна, вам слово.
The floor is yours. Thank you, Ginevra Igorevna, Natalia Sergeevna, the student, the graduate of our department. I have known her since her first year, her bachelor's course, master's course, and so finally she's ready to present her thesis. Her path was launched, and back in December 2007, the department recommended, but Natalia Sergeevna, and she continued to work on her theme to bring her in the ideal form. So I tried not to argue with this decision, as I knew that this hard work has to be done, and I think it's a very high quality, independent work. And I don't know how we reached this, how we arrived to this theme, but Alf Ross and Validity, and so this theme kept the degree applicant and myself very tense, and it took some. So the results of many years of hard work, Natalia Sergeevna is ready to present to you. Thank you. Thank you, Elena Vladimirovna. You will be given the floor later on after the degree applicant makes a speech and the council members make a speech. Let us continue, dear council members, and let us give the floor. Let me give the floor to myself. First to myself.
Диссертация Натальи Сергеевны Васильевой на соискание ученой степени кандидата юридических наук по специальности 12.00.01 теории истории права и государства, истории учения о праве и государстве на тему проблемы действительности права, правовой концепции Альфа-Росса, принято к защите приказом ученого секретаря СПБГУ от 13 февраля 2020 года. Количество публикаций соискателей, в которых излагаются основные научные результаты диссертации, согласно представленному списку, 6 работ, в рецензируемых научных изданиях из перечня утвержденного Минобрнауки Российской Федерации 5 публикаций, в изданиях, индексируемых в наукометрических базах данных Web of Science и Scopus, публикаций нет. Соискатель представил ученому секретарю СПБГУ полный пакет документов. Все представленные соискателем документы по полученной мной информации от куратора защиты Ларисы Викторовны Хрущевой соответствуют предъявляемым требованиям и хранятся в аттестационном деле соискателя, а копии их у Ларисы Викторовны. Но перед тем, как представить слово соискателю, У меня вопрос. Есть ли у вас тоже вопросы, уважаемые члены диссертационного совета? Какие-то вопросы, общие вопросы к соискателю? Есть ли необходимость рассматривать, оглашать весь список представленных соискателем документов на защиту? Как вы думаете, уважаемые члены совета? Спасибо, спасибо. Тогда слово предоставляется Наталье Сергеевне. Напоминаю, 15 минут, и вам слово.
Before I start, I'd like to check if you are able to see my presentation at the same time simultaneously and the video. After I started the presentation. Yes, we can hear you. We can see the presentation. All is well. Thank you. Dear Chairman and Dissertation Council members, dear guests and listeners, let me present to you my thesis on this theme. The issue of legal validity is one of the key issues. It touches upon a wide range of interrelated issues, including the nature of law, the relationship between law and morality, coexertion and law, normality and effectiveness of law. However, the issue of validity of the law itself is most often not in the main focus of researchers. In the 1960s, in theory of law, there was an important discussion about the reality of law as it still exists in the modern science. One of the main participants of this discussion was Danish lawyer, representative of the Scandinavian legal realism, Alf Ross. However, his concept is almost unknown to domestic science, and in modern studies, there's a number of misconceptions about the contents of Ross's concept, not at least related to the defects of translation. In course of my research, a number of problems had to be solved in order to achieve the main goal of the work, to construct a concept and to justify the validity of law in the legal concept of Alf Ross. First task was theoretical and legal, related to the unclear notion of validity of law. This uncertainty had to be overcome and further research. A separate semantic block of the thesis is devoted to the solution of this problem. I think it is necessary to distinguish, on the one hand, the concept of validity of law, and on the other hand, justify the validity of law. Many studies have been devoted to justifying the validity of law, but none of them specify what is the validity of law, what is meant by this term, and there's no information about its use. In that connection, Thesis proposed the so-called instrumental notion of validity of law, which is, it seems to me, free from philosophical, methodological preconditions. The validity is a right. Its essential attribute can be considered a binding force of the right, triggering a specific mechanism of normative impact on behavior. Different types of legal understanding focus mainly on justification, validity of the right, and such justification will already be conditioned by the approach to the right. Another block of the thesis devoted to consideration of Ross's concept and his approach to the validity of law in the course of history of legal thought. Analysis of the existing approaches has made it possible to distinguish two main ones, metaphysical and anti-metaphysical approach. The first one is typical for many natural legal concepts and can be for various legal positivism, from atheism, legitimism, to analytical pure doctrine of law and psychological legal realism. It was also concluded that the metaphysical approach uses sign of conformity of the law as an a priori metaphysical standard, while the anti-metaphysical approach uses a sign of coercion in a broad sense, not only physical, but also mental. The anti-metaphysical tradition has been considered in its development, and the Ross's concept of validity of law has been considered as a unifying its significant profession. The work pays attention to the discussion of Ross and representative of the contemporary legal positivism. It also revealed points of contact between the concept of Ross's law reality and the pure doctrine of Hans Kelsen's law, namely the understanding of law as a system of norms addressed to law enforcement agencies. And also these points with Herbert Hart, namely the normative ideology of law enforcement agencies and the inner point of view, the empirically verified fact of mental reality as a basis for validity of law. In addition, the Ross's legal concept has been considered as part of such trends in the legal theory as the Scandinavian legal realism and psychological legal reasoning. It was possible to trace a single line of reasoning about the reality of law in the psychological legal realism, combining the psychological school of law of Leo Petrozhitsky, Scandinavian legal reasoning, the concept of Enrico Tara. The characteristic features are notions about the norm as a motive for behavior, about psychologically experienced self as an aspect of reality, about the experience of reality of law as a phenomenon of the psyche, as an impulse associated with the concept of behavior, and objectification of such impulses, which gives rise to the idea of the mystical, authoritarian nature of law. The analysis of Ross's concept made it possible to conclude that it is in line with the psychological legal realism. Ross asserts that the legal phenomenon is based on special impulses, specific phenomena, experience in combination with the intellectual representation of the mode of action. Such impulses become a motive for behavior and create an illusion of existence of law as an objectively existent phenomenon that exists outside the psychophysical reality and is bound mystically and autocratically binding the will of people. The third semantic block of my work is the study of Ross's legal concept and reconstruction of his ideas about the problem of validity of law. An important role here was played by the study of the relationship between the terms used in the Danish original works and English and Russian translations. A Danish jurist devised the concept of validity of law and validity of Gelden law, which in the English translation are denoted by the same term validity, which leads to distortion of his thought. The notion of validity of law is cleared of metaphysical and reinterpreted facts. Certain psychophysical experiences recognized as the basis of the legal phenomenon. The reality of law appears as conceptual rationalism, objectification of such experience. Validity of law is connected in Ross with the psychic world of the people. It is manifested in the facts of reality as the effectiveness of law. Experiences of reality are embodied in the behavior of people. And in this concept, this problem becomes a proper subject of jurisprudence, according to Ross. Identify the effective law in the study of human behavior. According to Ross, it is possible to conclude what is experienced and rationalized by people as the actual law, as a substantiation of the validity and efficacy of law. Ross's concept points to a combination of two motives, conditioned and unconditioned bound interests, a combination of fear of the threat of physical coercion and respect for the authority of the institutionalized system. As an additional semantic unit, I have the analysis of Ross's reasoning about the possibility and methodology of studying specific law. The actual state of affairs in a specific legal system as an important part of Ross's legal concept is his draft doctrinal study of law as a descriptive study of the current law and effective legal system that differs from the prescriptive legal policy. This project is based on the distinction between norms and judgments about norms. That in this study of law, it is possible to make logically correct statements about effective law. At the same time, such statements are intended only for legal science. Ross's effective law means normative content of ideas uh, which can be part of the motivation of an enforcer when he makes a decision on a specific case. An effective legal system, which consists of norms in the minds of law enforcers, is viewed by Ross as a seam for interpreting their behavior. Verification of statements about the effective law and their predictive function are based on the hypothesis that actions of law enforcers are based on an intersubjective normative ideology, the existence of which allows to interpret the behavior of law enforcers as a single whole of meaning and motivation and make predictive statements about the effective law. The study of the problem of validity of law being the legal concept of Alf Ross, in particular, made a significant contribution to the understanding of social and psychological mechanisms of the normative impact of law on behavior, and thus enriched the anti-metaphysical tradition of justifying the validity of law. The reality of validity of law cannot be considered in isolation from subjects as some objective property of the law, in no way related to the activity of the consciousness and behavior. Thank you for your attention.
Discussion.
Questions to the applicant strictly on her presentation and the contents of her thesis, and the answers should not take more than 2 minutes. Do council members have any questions?
Valentina Viktorovna,
Valentina Viktorovna, your question, please. Natalia Sergeevna, could you please explain how Ross's concept relates to the modern reality, legal reality, how he's understanding the law as some kind of directive can be used, can be applied to the Russian legal system and used by the Russian judges. Thank you for your question. I think, first of all, here's interesting the concept of sources of law. Ross is interesting. Unlike other realists, Ross does not diminish the significance of the sources of law and emphasize the special role of legislation. But unlike more formal approaches, he indicates that we should pay more attention to to the real situation, not only the norms set forth in legal acts. As I think this position can be useful to analyze the current situation with the sources of law in the Russian Federation, where, of course, there's no unity in understanding of the scientific community of what is the source of law. But such uncertainty can be somehow relieved by using the Ross's concept. Please say again. May I ask a question? Dear Natalia Sergeevna, considering that you look at anti-metaphysical concept, I have this question. In your opinion, what is the structure of the anti-metaphysicality, and does it have various degrees? Thank you for your question. In reality, the difficult part here is that you can at the same time kind of consider the anti-metaphysical tradition of the theory of law in general and the anti-metaphysical approach to validity of law. And though they touch upon each other, these are two different, so anti-metaphysical approach to validity of law. And as I said, such anti-metaphysical approach to reality can coexist within the framing of positivist concept. As for the degree of anti-metaphysicality, I think it is possible, but defining such a degree will be too relative. There will be no agreement in the scientific community. They will just criticize, scientists will just criticize each other. And also, I'd like to say that I was guided by a clear position of expressed by the scientists. If they said to forget all metaphysics. Thank you. I have a question, please. Thank you. Yes, Valentina Viktorovna, I see that you definitely support such denial of the metaphysical transition. Within this study, I set myself the task to stay as neutral as possible. I understand that a researcher always has an impact, and it's impossible to completely eradicate that, but I tried to stay as objective as possible. And I think that my own opinion I will form in the future.
Спасибо.
As I continue working on
Есть ли
this.
еще вопросы, уважаемые члены Совета?
Do we have? Yes, I have a question, Ginevra Igorevna. Thank you. My question is as follows. You made a strong statement that the concept suggested by the author is free from the philosophical and methodological assumptions. So your formula is very objective. And in connection with this, I would like to ask on which understanding of law did you use to formulate this concept, this approach of yours? Because in order to say something about the law, you have to have some understanding of what the law actually is, because otherwise you offer an empty abstract, make an abstract statement which can be perfect but does not disclose the phenomenon that we are trying to understand. So what is your what's your position? Who do you support? Thank you for your question. Deliberately, I did not use any approach to define this definition, and I don't claim it is objective. I just claim it is instrumental. I made this statement and applied it to all concepts considered in my thesis, and it can be applied to all the concepts. Okay, thank you. Okay, I shall save my questions for later.
Есть ли еще вопросы, уважаемые члены Совета? Если вопросов нет, то у меня есть вопросы. Вопрос такой. Наталья Сергеевна, если право в концепции Росса – это феномен индивидуальной психики, то как объясняется универсальность права? И как объяснить наличие одинаковых, схожих правовых переживаний у значительных групп людей? Вот такой вопрос.
Here is my question. Thank you for your question. This is a difficult question because dramatic transition from individual to public is the basis of Ross's concept, and for psychological legal realism is for Ross. To explain this transition, he uses processes of upbringing, socialization, existence of actions of organized public force, cultural traditions, which defines the understanding of law.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Продолжаем.
Let us continue.
Многоуважаемые члены диссертационного совета, мы должны перейти к выступлениям членов совета, но сначала нужно решить такой вопрос. Наталья Сергеевна может отвечать на отзыв после каждого из выступающих, либо сразу на все отзывы. Вот я должна это определить. Предлагаю Наталье Сергеевне сразу отвечать на все отзывы. Согласны ли вы, Наталья Сергеевна? Спасибо. Я должна также сообщить о внешних отзывах. Но, насколько мне известно, внешних отзывов не поступило. Поэтому начинаем выступление членов Совета. Поскольку все эти отзывы были опубликованы на сайте СПБГУ, то предлагаю изложить только основные моменты, вопросы, замечания и так далее. Нет ли возражений, уважаемые члены диссертационного совета? Нет возражений? Если возражений нет, то позвольте предоставить слово Валентине Викторовне Лапаевой для оглашения отзыва.
Am I right that I don't have to read the entire review? I thought it's my responsibility to read. Then I'd like to say that the thesis was very interesting, which makes up a big gap in the history of law, theory of law, Scandinavian legal realism, and in particular, maybe first of all, works of Alf Ross. And the thesis makes up for this gap, and on very high level. As about the advantages, I'd like to say what I already mentioned in my question. I think maybe I exaggerate. No matter how much theory in it, the possibility of practical use to our reality, especially psychological realism, and I expect it to be the connection with Russian reality to be outlined. But unfortunately, I have to make this connection myself. Unfortunately, the author didn't pay attention to that. Relevance of the study is realistic philosophy in the issues of philosophy, and I am grateful to the author for I watched this discussion, and the purpose of this panel discussion was the modern epistemology passes to etymology, and to understand this real existence, they use non-positivist but metaphysical methodology. They said this openly. This was stated openly. So such connection seemed to be a little bit far-fetched, but these critical remarks should not be seen as critical. So I just like to see this connection with reality. Yet the thesis is certainly relevant. It fills in a scientific gap. It is well written to represent the results in the educational process, which is sufficient for the candidate's thesis. The structure of the thesis is a little bit unusual, only 2 chapters, but this is justified by the tasks and objectives of the author. The general definition of validity of law seemed, but it is so well grounded and can include various approaches. As for the own position of the author, though I think she advocates the positivist approach because she criticizes metaphysical understanding for law and morality. So that will be my comment. This is a significant drawback for me because the author ignored such a significant trend in the legal law, which offers a different approach, different from the positivist approach and from the traditional natural legal approach. I mean, the libertarian theory, which defines law and morality as a equal morality, equality. Unfortunately, the author, I wouldn't say she doesn't understand, but she's not familiar, which can be seen in her criticism of works by Varlamova. Though Varlamova in her work proves that validity of law, which is relevant for the positivist tradition, but for libertarian understanding of law, this issue is not that important, because if law corresponds to some metaphysical criteria, then it is valid for positive is validity. And in other approaches, they don't have this issue. And so basically, that's so the position of Varlamova in her understanding of validity of law seemed very, very convincing, consistent, and richer than the position of Alf Ross and the author. These comments, of course, do not diminish the significance of the work. The work is written in the best tradition of St. Petersburg legal school. It's pays lots of attention to definitions. The author offers her own interpretation of Russian, English, and Danish texts. The list of foreign literature is impressive, and in that sense, the thesis corresponds to all the requirements applied to an independent. And I think I have to finish reading my review that the thesis by Vasilyeva and Sergeevna on the theme problem of legal validity in Alf Ross's legal law corresponds to the requirements set by the order on awarding academic degrees at St. Petersburg University, and the degree or applicant, Vasilyeva and Sergeevna, deserves to be awarded the degree of candidate of legal sciences, specialty 120001. Thank you for your attention. Dear colleagues,
Есть у меня сейчас?
Yes, can you hear me?
Есть звук?
Yes, yes,
Спасибо.
you can hear me.
Спасибо.
Okay, thank you.
Тогда я с удовольствием передаю слово
I would like to
профессору, тоже доктору юридических наук Илье Львовичу Честнову для оглашения своего отзыва.
Ilya Lvovich Chesnov.
Илья Львович, вы слышите меня?
Ilya Lvovich, can you hear me? Yes, thank you for giving the floor to me. Though I thought we shall follow the alphabetical order, but that's okay. Dear Chairman, dear members of the Dissertation Council, dear attendees, dear guests, let me present a review to the thesis by Vasilyeva Natalia Sergeevna. You know the theme already. First, I would like to say that I was very impressed by the work by Natalia Sergeevna, and it seemed to me that there is some potential to address practical issues of law in the sense of anthropology and the social cultural mechanism of law. And indeed, there's no direct connection with practice of modern legal reality. At the same time, analysis is a new approach to practical issues of jurisprudence. So this is to answer Valentina Viktorovna's comments. Her comment, I would like to support the author. I have the feeling that the concept of middle of the 20th century of careful study of this period definitely such immersion in the life and work of Alfred Ross, in my opinion, is an advantage of the thesis. And of course, the theoretical analysis of validity of law through which the author reaches the philosophical metaphysical issues, which she said she denies, but which are present in her work. But in general, I think the thesis by Natalia Sergeevna Vasilyeva in its right can be considered the first study in the national of interpreting Genesis and development of the anti-metaphysical tradition of validity of law, reconstruction of analysis of the key points of Alf Ross's concept, especially in its application to the social psychological mechanism of impact of law. The thesis characterized by good logic, clear language, independence of the author is beyond doubt. There are many the author has many publications. At the same time, in my opinion, this interesting study has some points for discussion. First, as a discussion point, let me pay attention to an important provision submitted for defense. The study of the problem of validity of law, the discussion of which involves representatives of different types of legal understanding, is necessary to have a common ground and instrumental concept of validity of law, free from restrictions, depending on the approach of the law. So this is what she already mentioned in her presentation. Validity of law can be considered as a binding force of law, giving rise to specific mechanism of normative influence on behavior. And in contrast to the instrumental concept of validity, the ground of validity of law is inseparable from the choice of certain approach to the right. It represents variously interpreted grounds, the binding force of the right. Page 16, 31, 48, 49 of the thesis. I believe that such a complex and important concept as validity of law cannot be given in a conventional or purely instrumental. It refers to abstract notions that are formed metaphysically on the basis of metaphorization and are defined or given through case studies. which inevitably leads to differences in understanding, not validity, the very validity of law, as well as many other theoretical concepts of jurisprudence. It becomes contextual, depending on this, based on the understanding of law, which has already been mentioned by Professor Stovda. Second, work does not investigate the question of Ross's attitude to the possibility or impossibility of existence of an independent deontological logic of norms of law, which indirectly refers to the reality of law, should get more attention, taking into account the fact that the Danish law theorists in late 30s and early 40s spoke on this issue. And on deontological logic, as mentioned, mentions his study, and in some other mechanisms. Third, the author claims that two approaches, the validity of law and the legal science and philosophy, are the metaphysical through moral norms and anti-metaphysical through coercion, interpreted in a broad sense. Provisions 4 to 6. However, in my opinion, there's also the dialectical approach to justification, the validity of law within the classical paradigm. In the post-classical approach, to which the author doesn't pay sufficient attention, the author's statement that modern post-classical studies of law focus on the recognition of the law on issues of authority, which in itself is not new, but the post-classical methodology provides a different level and angle of consideration on the problem of legitimacy of law, which can be solved both in reference to metaphysical and anti-metaphysical way. Here I am quoting page, as well as the presentation of the positions of Polyakov, and do not reflect the main differences between the classical, post-classical, for example, communicative rationality, emblematicity, culturality, contextuality, are fundamentally different from coercion, even the broad sense of the word, the justification of the validity of law. Nevertheless, these points do not affect the general conclusion. The thesis by Natalia Sergeevna Vasilyeva fully corresponds to the requirements set by the order of the 1st of September 2016, number 6821/1, on the order of awarding academic degrees in St. Petersburg University, and degree or applicant Natalia Sergeevna deserves to be awarded the degree of Candidate of Legal Sciences, specialty 120001. I thank you for your attention. I'm glad to give the floor to Alexey Vyacheslamovich Stovda. Alexey Vyacheslamovich, welcome.
Alexey Vyacheslamovich, вам слово.
Yes, thank you very much. Speaking of the thesis, should be mentioned that the thesis is real and it's there. That's the most important thing. I enjoyed reading it. It took me a long time looking for looking for the weak points and where can catch the author out. But as I think Valentina Viktorovna already mentioned, even the subject, the object, where it's usually easy to catch out the author, prove that even with this, the author managed to deal well. Of the positive aspects, I'd like to pay attention to the fundamental approach and the approach and of the provisions put out for defense. Indeed, there were some comments maybe about the strange structure of the thesis, but in reality, I think the structure is justified because in order to understand what we are talking about, the validity of law, not to turn into a formal concept, it was necessary to show this connection of theoretical debates with in the middle of the 20th century to show that the problem is there and caused much discussion. But this leads to critical comments or remarks which can be given about the thesis. In the very general sense, my key comment is this, that if the thesis is aimed at validity of law per se, then the result should be own understanding of validity, and it should be put for defense. But if we stay in the concept of Alf-Ross, then first of all, it would be necessary to focus on understanding of validity of Ross and reconstruct it as carefully as possible. But if we follow the path taken by the author, who proposes her own, she thinks, free of philosophical and metaphysical understanding of validity, and on the other hand, set herself the task to reconstruct Ross's opinions, then we end up in a discussion between own understanding of validity of law of the author and the understanding of validity of law of Alfred Ross. They do not, which do not coincide. They are in a certain opposition with each other, and this I mentioned in my reviews. I will not repeat myself because Ross uses in threefold meaning the concept of validity, and the two denies, and the author forms a very broad concept of validity, uses all three approaches. Thus, here it was necessary either to criticize Ross from her own opinion, or to reach the general theoretical level and maybe change the subject of the study, to proceed to validity as such. Even though it's making such a wide and instrumental understanding of validity, the author stays in the framework of certain methodological assumptions. Here, I would like to quote: if we talk, the norm exists, we mean that the norm is valid. The norms are valid for those whose experience, whose behavior they regulate. To say that a norm is valid for an individual means that the individual has to behave as prescribed by the norm. That doesn't mean that the individual definitely behaves, that his behavior corresponds to the norm. So the norm is valid. So this quote is from Kelsen, a pure teaching about the law. And the concept of validity offered by the author is very similar to this definition of Kelsen. So which means that my main claim, or maybe comment, rather comment, means says that the author, despite being objective, stays within the metaphysical teaching of existing and what exists and what should exist. She understands the law as something that should exist, that regulates from a safe distance something that actually exists, behavior of an of an individual. This understanding is certainly well grounded, but at the same time that neglects all the post-classical approaches, post-metaphysical approach. For example, if we look at the communicative theory of law, there the law is a part of the human behavior which it has to regulate from a safe distance. Or if we take the approach of Ilya Lvovich, the law itself is a dialogue or a type of human behavior. It cannot distance itself from human behavior through coercion mechanisms. This is a secondary or specific cases of some legal situation. That is why, if to sum it up, I think that the author fell between two fundamental tasks to define validity of law as in general, which required her own approach, and reconstruction of validity, the concept of validity of Alfred Ross, which implies to some degree denial of certain opinion and making oneself one with the reconstructed teaching. But what I just said, these evidences not drawbacks but advantages of the thesis, because it is real. It makes one think. It does not. It leaves the opponent, a member of the council, to think, to reveal some issues, and that, of course, is a big advantage of the thesis and probably of the academic advisor. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that I enjoyed the thesis. It is very carefully written. It is, to some degree, reminded me my first steps, because my first text, which I translated from Russian into English and published, was published in 2004, Problems of Philosophy in Ukraine. And my first Congress, same as with Natalia Sergeevna, was a VR in 2005 in Grenade. And I like that their theme is a synthesis of history and philosophy, which gives it practical significance because it makes up for a significant gap of knowledge of Russian-speaking reader of Scandinavian legal realism. So in general, I think that the thesis is good, written well, and I think that it deserves to be awarded the degree. Thank you.
Спасибо, Алексей Вячеславович.
Thank you, Alexey Vyacheslavovic. And I would like to give the floor to Sergey Fedorovich Udartsev. Welcome, Sergey Fedorovich. Thank you, Geneva Igorevna. Dear colleagues, the thesis is the serious work, fundamental work, interesting work, and deserves close attention. Makes up for certain gaps. Очень плохо слышно. Makes up for certain gaps and Scandinavian law. I prepared a review which was published, so I shall only focus on some key points. Provisions set for defense seemed new, well grounded and proven in the work to me, those some points to me seem discussable. And let me mention only a couple of them. In provision 6, for example, the author, dear Natalia Sergeevna, focuses on a coercive nature of law, which she studies and considering the great number of levels and spheres which the law regulates, and as it develops and the society develops, so maybe law is more the wider phenomenon that can be given a more accurate characteristics in its nature. Is this understanding, which is not always more accurate, and to a certain degree is a apology of coercion and violence, be it the fascist regime or supportive regimes which existed in Europe. The second point, очень плохо слышно, to which I would like to pay attention, well proven, the ideas sometimes sparks there. And this absence of interest is very many different expression represented by different institutions. So maybe here also I would like to say that these comments for different works, serious works, so we would like dear members of the Dissertation Council, I think we need to take a technical break. Let me call a technical break to eliminate for how long. So when shall we? I cannot tell you exactly. So shall we connect Shall we reconnect every 10 minutes, or do we have to stay?
Ну, давайте подключаться через каждые 5 минут.
Or every 10 minutes, or every 5 minutes, it's up to you.
Давайте через каждые 10 минут.
Okay, let's try to get back after 10 minutes.
Я согласна, спасибо.
I agree, thank you. Thank you. his speech. Dear colleagues, maybe you could not hear me well. I said that different levels call for different comments or different discussions. That is why this seeing the potent potential to see another aspect speaks in favor of the thesis and of the author rather than as anti-metaphysical or anti-metaphysical. I would like to draw your attention to a couple of issues regarding the fact, some points that may result in comments or questions. Own reconstruction of the theory of this with a nice name, Alfred Ross, starts in the middle of the work. Though very briefly, the author touches upon it would be possible to structure the work differently, but we have what we have, and we have to live with it. Because the thesis is very interesting. Both parts of the work are well professionally written and are quite independent. And the theme of the thesis and the title of the thesis, they seem to relate only in part to the first part. Maybe it would make more sense with such structure to change the name of the thesis, because it is dedicated not to one theoretician, but also to a number of others. Another comment. Another comment.
Да что? Вот заработала. Да. Давай. Спасибо тебе, вот слушаю. Вот хотя плохо работает, Сергей Федорович, вот с задержкой, как будто он из Африки.
Cannot hear Sergei Fedorovich.
Хорошо, спасибо тебе. Счастливо.
Продолжается.
Please continue. Sergei Fedorovich, please continue your review.
Вы следующий.
You'll be next. Also, I would like to draw attention to empirical verification of ethical judgments, which is connected to some degree with the nature of the positive theory, maybe the main ideas. Such verification, such practical approach is very important. The matter is, as it seems to me, let's call this metaphysics or dialectical philosophy or other type of philosophy, non-metaphysical, because metaphysics is not an accepted term which can include everything in philosophy. The general provisions about law are always abstract. They intangible. They are product of thought, they apply to what cannot be seen, what you can nothing see with your eyes and with your experience with your senses, as well as in the modern physics, where quantum physics theoretical physicists have reached such fundamental things that a human will never see, but can only calculate and maybe theoretically create instruments to measure in very distant future. But theoretically, it can be proven and it works without us seeing this. So these points cannot be denied, and we should not call them drawbacks of, and also I'd like to pay attention to the fact that even though the thesis is brilliant work, which is a good example of St. Petersburg law school, which is a leader in couple decades in the study of foreign legal thought, it's impossible to ignore the Moscow School of Law and some theoreticians who are schools themselves. And here I was a little bit surprised that when considering the positivist theories, the doctoral thesis on by Zorkin was maybe omitted, maybe by accidentally, even though it was written with a different background and represented a different line of thought, but it's one of the first works, one of the major works which studied group, also studied by the author of this thesis. The work is such as Valery Dmitrovich, local opponent, whose speech resulted in him missing one voice at Moscow University. And this opponent is quoted, and his work was 15 minutes. Let me remind you, but Zorkin's work is forgotten, not because the chairman, but because this is he's a very interesting thinker and theoretician. And if you allow me, I shall take 2 more minutes. When he defended his thesis for the first time, a very young man at Moscow University, my sister was a student, a doctoral student, and I sent her a letter. I recommended her to attend Zorkin's defense because he is a rising star of legal thought. She went, recorded, took notes, and then she sent me this long letter. And so I can imagine very well what happened and who spoke there. But then in the State Institute of Law, Valery Dmitrovich, his second attempt was successful and published a monograph. In general, I think should not ignore another point, of course, materialism is the Marxist philosophy in USSR is a thing of the past. So here we cannot say anything different, but we should also remember that one of the world leaders, the competition, we don't know the result, is China, which moves at the or convergence of two ideas, is first thing. And secondly, there is nothing exists, nothing arises at a particular moment of time. There's all the main teachings of the 20th century the different forms, and they are only variations. And I think that one of such teachings is true, authentic, and because they are all eternal and they reflect different facets of law, and integrate them it makes sense. This approach is clever. But in general, I think that the thesis is very good. The author is well trained. Together with the academic advisor, they have worked well, and all the speculations I have just given, they do not affect the overall positive opinion about the work. And in general, the thesis by Vasilyeva Natalia Sergeevna fully corresponds to the requirements applied to candidates' thesis, and Natalia Sergeevna, as an applicant, fully deserves the degree. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much, Sergei Fedorovich. We apologize for the technical issues. And on time, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Professor Igor Yuryevich Kozlikhin joined us, to whom I'm very pleased to give the floor. Welcome. It took me a long time to tune this system. Thank you, Ivan, to tune my computer. So what can I say? This is an excellent work, a serious work. Natalia, well done, Natalia. She wrote many good things. I don't have any major critical comments. The fact that defense is going well is obvious. So these are not comments, reminders. And Sergei Fedorovich spoke a lot about Zorkin. Natalia said Soviet theory of law was poor. This is not exactly true. Works were published, and I said in my thesis that the term many monographs were published on the course of law, the power of law. So Ambrose, of course, did well in USSR. And in general, the work is very interesting, well written, and I vote for, if I have the right, because I was late to join, I am for awarding the clever scientist, no-nonsense scientist. Thank you, Igor Yuryevich. So I will try to make my speech brief, if you don't mind, council members. So let me present my report and let me cover all the mandatory points, such as relevance. The thesis makes up for
Я думаю, что она действительно вовлекает. Это уже сейчас в процессе обсуждения обнаружилось отечественных ученых. Вот нас с вами тоже обсуждение фундаментальных проблем философии и права. Я бы еще сказала про научную программу исследования этой проблемы. Интерпретационная модель обоснования РОСом действительности права актуализирует вот эту научную программу и вообще весь комплекс связанных с ней проблем в теоретическом правоведении. В своем отзыве я еще отметила науковедческие, образовательно-педагогические аспекты актуальности диссертационной темы. И я думаю, вот, Валентина Викторовна, что касается практики, то актуализируется исследование в сфере судебной методологии, которые имеют очевидное практическое значение. Что касается обоснованности, ну, скрупулезнейшим образом, конечно, обоснованы все положения, и аутентичность, научная обоснованность, реконструкции автором проблемы действительности права в правовой концепции Альфа-Росса достигаются в результате анализа этой проблемы и в контексте развития представления о праве и действительности права юридико-позитивистской традиции. Вот не буду все перечислять, но в том числе и в 20 веке. И в контексте критического анализа основных современных концепций, связанных с определением понятия действительности права, в том числе и отечественных. И в контексте содержательной полемики с исследователями творчества Росса. И в контексте критического анализа дискуссии между Хартом и Россом, критики идеи Росса Евгением Викторовичем Булыгиным, а это все это очень интересно и важно. И путем выделения ключевых понятий в правовой концепции Росса. Я не думаю, что напрасно как раз вот весь этот многогранный труд осуществлен Натальей Сергеевной. Достоверность, она очевидна. Что касается научной новизны, то я хочу подчеркнуть, что автор не ограничивается узким, непосредственным исследованием заявленной темы. Как раз это достоинство, что, кстати, вполне соответствовало бы цели и задачам кандидатской диссертации. Так что я думаю, здесь как раз превышены требования, предъявляемые кандидатской диссертации. Наталья Сергеевна ставит перед собой успешно решает сверхзадачу реконструировать понятие обоснования действительности права в правовой концепции Альфа-Росса в контексте выделяемой в диссертации юридико-позитивистской правового реализма, традиции правового реализма и скандинавского, и континентального традиции правовой мысли. И вот мне кажется, что то, что Наталье Сергеевне удалось вовлечь нас в дискуссию, свидетельствует проблема инструментальности понятия действительности права. Я признаюсь, что в свое время при обсуждении на кафедре диссертации я рассуждала так же, как Валентина Викторовна и некоторые другие участники сегодняшней дискуссии. Но снова вернувшись сейчас, года два прошло, я изменила свое мнение и подумала, что а почему бы и не прибегнуть к такому инструментальному понятию? Это практически полезно. Вот у меня, я руковожу грантом. 10 человек занимаются этим грантом. С чего начать? Что искать? Давайте определим инструментальное, ну, то понятие, о котором идет речь, инструментальное понятие, ну, а дальше уже будем разбираться. Какие-то разные обоснования, как-то их, может быть, здесь будет какой-то, так сказать, консенсус, а может быть и нет, а может быть мы представим все возможные точки зрения по этой проблеме. Поэтому я как раз считаю, что это перспективно. И вот, как мне кажется, я еще не попробовала, но это может оказаться практически полезным. Ну, что касается уже с каких позиций, метафизических или антиметафизических, может быть, антиметафизическое стоило здесь дать позитивное какое-то определение, тем более, что действительно Наталья Сергеевна сама говорит о юридико-позитивистском подходе в данном случае и подходе реалистов. Это уже другой вопрос. Я говорю только об инструментальности понятия. Да. Все ново, многое отличается новизной, И я бы еще вот отметила, что такое новизной, отличается выявление анализ автором единой линии рассуждений о действительности права в рамках психологического реализма от Петрожицкого до Платара, и в которую вписывается также концепция Альфа-Росса. Я считаю, что эта диссертация является несомненным вкладом в исследование идей правового реализма, его истоков, эволюции, научных перспектив и так далее. И только некоторые, отдельные критические соображения в порядке дискуссии, даже не столько дискуссий, какие-то соображения критические соображения по диссертации. Первое. Такого науковедческого характера, скорее. Автор относит творчество Росса к скандинавскому правовому реализму, его второму поколению, страница 113. Одновременно Росс для автора нетипичный представитель скандинавского правового реализма, по крайней мере, его первого поколения, страница 141-142. Концепция Росса как представителя скандинавского правового реализма вписывается, согласно ее реконструкции, автором и в континентальный правовой реализм. Более того, она соответствует, утверждает автор, основным чертам континентального психологического правового реализма, страница 18, 121, 122. И вообще, континентальный правовой реализм, по мнению автора, объединяет психологическую школу Петрожицкого и скандинавский правовой реализм, включая концепцию Росса, страница 16. Так является ли в конечном счете скандинавский правовой реализм самостоятельным направлением в рамках правового реализма, а Росс его представителем первого или второго поколения, пусть и нетипичным. Далее. Альф-Росс позиционировал себя как ученого, предложившего новый подход к праву и правовым проблемам, альтернативный юридическому позитивизму и школе естественного права, страница 144, а также историко-социологической школе права, страница 157. Тем не менее, например, Евгений Викторович Булыгин рассматривает концепцию Росса как улучшенную, по его мнению, версию позитивистской теории права. Для автора диссертации очевидно, по крайней мере, то, что концепция Росса относится к антиметафизической традиции правовой мысли и, соответственно, к одному из направлений или обоим правового реализма. Означает ли это, что концепцию Росса можно отнести к юридическому, социологическому, психологическому позитивизму в его широком понимании? Или автор готов усмотреть в концепции Росса некий третий, а многие вот уже сказали, красные, белые, зеленые, может нет никаких зеленых, а может они и есть, а мы их знаем, мы их любим и так далее. Вот. Или это третий путь в теоретическом правоведении. Конечно, эти замечания никак не влияют на общую оценку, очень высокую оценку обсуждаемой диссертации, и поэтому я рада произнести эти слова. Диссертация Натальи Сергеевны Васильевой соответствует всем требованиям, всем необходимым требованиям. Спасибо за внимание. И если нет возражений у членов Совета, продолжим наше заседание. Нет возражений? Продолжим наше заседание. Я должна огласить вопросы, поступившие в течение заседания по итогам просмотра трансляции заседания диссертационного совета. Вот, насколько мне известно, вопросов не поступило. Поэтому я предоставляю слово Наталье Сергеевне для ответа на отзывы членов диссертационного совета. Пожалуйста, Наталья Сергеевна, слышите ли вы меня, видите ли нас? Да, слышно. Пожалуйста, вам слово.
Dear council members, dear chairman, for your reviews, for your questions, recommendations, and remarks, which helped me to see new aspects and drawbacks of my work, and I will be guided by this critical consideration in the future. First, I will respond to general criticism expressed in several reviews, so which are very important for me, and then I will answer individual comments. First of all, I'd like to explain the need for a separate extensive study before starting work directly on the validity of law in the legal concept of Al-Faras. In the situation of research of foreign authors' works in translations, or sometimes even translation of translations, the terminology but concepts become important. Methodological grounds, scientific traditions, and schools of thought. Therefore, in this particular situation, it was necessary to start with the concept of validity of law, which made it possible to determine how Ross speaks about the validity of law. The same consideration of its legal concept served the same purpose. An extensive part outlining theories of different thinkers was necessary to substantiate the coercion as a distinctive feature of the anti-metaphysical approach to substantiate the validity of law, as well as to substantiate Ross's attitude to psychological legal realism. Here, I'd also like to say that sixth provision mentioned by Sergei Fedorovich, it applies to the anti-metaphysical approach to validity of law, and it considers coercion as a distinctive feature of law. As the matter is that when this is a coercion and not the will of the sovereign determines validity of law, Austin, it requires detailed argumentation, or, for example, when it is necessary to argue with the author of the idea of psychological legal reason in the context of possibility of describing Ross's theory to this. Here, I agree with critique of Sergei Fedorovich's criticism. Yet, I see nothing wrong with the fact that Ross's legal concept does not claim to be comprehensive and refers in many aspects to theoretical and applied aspects. I am very impressed by Ross's idea that legal research should be based primarily on the law we are dealing here and now. Moreover, in my research, I've tried to show that when considering Ross's theory and other anti-metaphysical theories, we should understand as conservative reactionary, much less as asserting the value of the existing legal order. For example, the Scandinavian legal realists of their time, they were real rebels against the conservatism. I would like to emphasize that no representative or anti-metaphysical trend diminishes the role and necessity of philosophical understanding of law and assessment of law from the point of view of morality, justice, or values. This is one of the ideas I try to reveal in the first part of my work devoted to Valentine's theories. None of them denies the need of history of law, legal policy, or evaluation of law, and none of them suggests blindly obeying any dictates of the law. The idea is simply to separate different types of law research. At the same time, I believe that despite its interpretation, Ross's theory possesses a number of promising ideas that can be developed in the modern theory of law, which, as Sergei Fedorovich rightly notes, need to meet the challenges of scientific and technological progress. Psychological legal realism, its concept of psychophysical reality, may turn the promising area of research into the problem of interaction between human consciousness and artificial intelligence. Moreover, as mentioned already in the applied aspect, the provisions of Ross's theory seem to be relevant in the context of theory of sources of law and judicial interpretation, to which project is in which I am participating is dedicated. I agree with the proposal to improve classification of approaches to justifying the validity of law. I also agree with Valentina Viktorovna's comment that the problem of validity of law is important not only for the positive jurisprudence, but can also be considered from the position of the metaphysical approach. Actually, in the thesis, it is expressed already in the classification of approaches. I agree with Sergei Fyodorovич's observation that consideration of metaphysical and anti-metaphysical tradition should be given more dialogue. At the same time, I'd like to emphasize that in my work, everything, including this classification, was subordinated to the goal of reconstruction, Rawls's concept. For the analysis of the dispute about the validity of law and Rawls's place in this dispute, such classification seems necessary and sufficient. Next, let me answer individual questions asked by opponents. To answer Valentina Viktorovna's questions. First, because we wanted to emphasize that the round table was mentioned, not say that realism is discussed at this round table as the same realism, but that it would be interesting to consider these two phenomena in a dialogue. In addition, there was a question as to why the metaphysical. First, because we wanted to emphasize the difference between approaches to the law and justifying validity of law. Secondly, its representatives themselves very clearly emphasize the anti-metaphysical orientation of their theories. The analytical and realistic directions within positivism are very different, but the main thing that unites them is not a question of connection between law and the state. Some of them deny this connection at all, but rather a critical attitude to the metaphysical foundations of the law. And thirdly, the term legal positivism has been somewhat discredited in domestic discourse and often identified solely with legitimacy. I agree that Vladimir Sabatovich concept can be attributed to the metaphysical approach. The thesis mentions that the metaphysical approach includes not only theories that mix law and morality, but also theories justifying the reality of law by a certain a priori standard, for example, pages 17 and 54. I agree, however, that this idea has not been stated quite clearly. As to the fact that approach in Natalia Vladimirovna's Varlama approach to reality is not expressed clearly, as mentioned in my work, here I mean the position Natalia Vladimirovna to relationship between reality and efficiency as undoubtedly justification of validity in the article is very detailed, and I'd like to emphasize that the article sets out Natalia Vladimirovna's position regarding not only justification of validity of law, but also the very concept of validity of law. And in this aspect, this work is one of the most important theoretical sources of the thesis. Next, for questions by Sergei Fyodorovich, I've already answered earlier. And I agree with the other answers, and I thank him for his recommendations. I'd like to say that Bentham's question about law and legislation is impossible to say that Bentham differentiated between the two concepts. At the same time, law for Bentham is while legislation in Bentham reduces legislation to law, saying that by law in general, we mean all the laws that exist, all the existing laws. Whilst for the purpose of jurisprudence, Bentham's theory, law is reduced to legislation. Next, I would like to answer questions from the review by the inability. Here is necessary to emphasize the idea was not in different, but in order to understand what we're talking about when you use this term. So this is a study of the case mentioned Ilya Lvovich. and it was necessary to understand in which context or how this term is used in the works by Ross and other researchers. And the concept of validity of law was called instrumental. The question about the no, is mentioned by Ilya Lvovich is only partly relates to and goes outside the objectives of our study, but of course that does not remove the possibility. At the same time, as for the logic of the thesis, provision 12, Ross's distinction between norms that cannot be ascribed to true meaning and these critical judgments about norms are at the basis of his project of study of law. Next, to answer questions by Alexei Vячеславовich. The question of whether the proposed instrumental concept of law can be applied to Ross's theory. I would like to say that although Ross talks a lot about reality, he does not limit himself, also investigates the problems of binding force of law, which he tries to interpret as in the anti-metaphysical case. The reality of the validity of law appears the conceptual realization of certain experiences of individuals. The experiences of reality, facts of mental reality, special impulses, motives, and to substantiate the special binding force of law, Ross turns to the idea of combining two types of motive, interest conditioned and non-interest conditioned. The existence of an institutionalized system of coercion ensures the emergence of interest-determined motive. This is the fear or threat of physical coercion. This motive coexists with non-substantiated motive, experience of reality of the law, belief in the authority of the system, its legitimacy. This is mechanism mentioned by Alexei Vячеslavich's article. They belong to Ross's consideration of the use of validity in general, not really in his concept. That is why I believe that detailed consideration of the Ross's concept enabled me to show applicability of this tool to consideration of the Ross's concept. And there was a question, should we move from reality to efficiency? I think that the terminology I've chosen and the emphasis allow us to consider and understand the Ross's concept and the concept of other legal teachings. And moreover, it seems that in the end, his concept is about reality. And the Ross's use of the special term gelden, which has been translated as validity, is not due to his rejection of the concept of validity, but his desire to emphasize his concept and to distance himself from the usual understanding of reality, especially from reality as a metaphysical idea of a priori binding force. The study of the problem of validity of law allows us to disagree with Bulugin's opinion that Ross excludes reality as a metaphysical idea of binding force, and to disagree with Hart's critical position, which focuses on validity in Ross's concept without noticing reality associated with the inner point of view, which led to a great misunderstanding between them. And I have already answered the question about incomplete classification in the beginning. At the same time, I would like to say that classification of approaches to metaphysical and anti-metaphysical in general corresponds to the difference. The metaphysical tradition justifies the validity of through idea, anti-metaphysical through a fact, as seen. So I cannot agree as absolutely proven that the positive law as well as the natural law is in line with the metaphysical tradition. From the point of the anti-metaphysical tradition, philosophers mentioned by Alexeyevich consider can be considered as a representative of the metaphysical tradition. And metaphysics is everything, includes everything that is not metaphysics. And now I'd like to answer Igor Yurievich. Part of his remarks I have already answered. And as for Soviet theory of law, it seems to me that it's not mentioned in the negative case, and I did not set myself this task. I just emphasized the isolation period, which has its positive and negative points. Now I'd like to answer questions asked by the chairman, Lukovskaya, Zhileva. As for the position of Ross's position on legal teachings, first, one can highlight American legalism and psychological or continental legal realism. The former was formed as opposition to the legal formalism in the context of problems of lawmaking, specific to the system of case law, while the latter developed in the spirit of continental philosophical and legal discourse. Psychological legalism includes Scandinavian legal realism, the development of which the first and the second generations can be distinguished. The first generation includes the Uppsala school, Hägerström and his students Oliver Krona and Lindstedt. Ross is also a student of Hägerström, but he did not adhere to the position of the Uppsala school. So he, together with some other later researchers, can be referred as the second generation of the Scandinavian legal realists. So I think that Ross is a typical representative of the Scandinavian legal realism, although not the most loyal follower of the Uppsala school. And about the legal positivism and whether Ross can be attributed to it. Yes, but it should be a legal positivism in its broadest sense, mentioned by Ginevra Igorevna. And yes, I believe that the concept of legal positivism should be expanded in domestic discourse. And once again, let me thank for your critical remarks and recommendations for future exploration of the theme. Thank you, Natalia Sergeevna. Thank you very much. Let us continue our session. And as promised, I'd like to give the floor to the academic advisor, once again, to the academic advisor of Natalia Sergeevna, Professor, Doctor of Legal Sciences, Elena Vladimirovna Timoshina. Elena Vladimirovna, can you hear us? Thank you, Ginevra Igorevna. Well, dear members of the Dissertation Council, today it was said already quite justly that so the thesis misses lacks something, and with many of your comments we agree. But I would like to emphasize that Natalia Sergeevna in her work succeeded to achieve, in my opinion, she succeeded to do what attracted attention for critical comments, the instrumental concept of validity. I think it seems interesting to me, an interesting attempt to divide the concept of validity and explanation of validity. These are two separate issues. Justification is why law is valid, but before we have to understand what that means. Of course, here we do not. The concept was not taken out of the blue, but we wanted to see, as mentioned by Natalia, to look at the context of usage of this concept. What is meant when Bulygin, Ross, or Hart what do they mean when they use this term. And I think as a result of such consideration, this concept was created. And as for the structure of the work, which has 2 chapters, and one chapter is dedicated to reconstruction of the anti-metaphysical tradition from Bentham to Potard, this serves a certain purpose, and in a sense, a study seems is like a nesting doll, where the smallest piece is Alf Ross. But in order to understand what Alf Ross wanted to say, considering all the inaccuracies of translation, considering existing traditions of understanding his works in foreign science, and in order to make our way through what he actually said, first we had to look at him in the context of anti-metaphysical tradition in general, and the continental legal realism, then psychological legal realism. And it seems important to me because when we see in retrospective Petrozhitsky and his school and prospect of normative realism of Potter, and Ross fits in between them, Ross's position becomes clearer to us, and we can see something typical in these speculations. This, of course, I agree that with what was mentioned by Sergei Fedorovich in his review, that without general concepts, social humanitarian sciences cannot exist, including jurisprudence. The realists themselves could not avoid such terrible scene of metaphysicality. So in the very concept of power they use, then isolated from taken out of natural sciences, it exists in jurisprudence, the metaphor, which they could not overcome. And so maybe I'd like to answer another consideration given by Valentina Viktorovna about the article in Issues of Philosophy dedicated to the realistic turn. I think such correlations are possible because realists deal with facts and as they think, but not with what is said about the facts. And the main marker, the realistic position, as said in this article, in Issues of Philosophy, the main marker, the realistic position, is following the correspondent theory of truth. And here Alf Ross was a supporter of this theory of truth, so his position can be seen as realistic because the subject are facts of psychological life, experiences of reality as a psychological fact, and respectively this correspondent theory of truth. Since I will not have an opportunity to speak again, I would like to thank all members of the Dissertation Council for agreeing to take part in the Dissertation Council, for their careful attitude to the work, for the discussion which took place, for your questions, because this enabled us to look at the work from a different angle, to see its drawbacks and shortcomings, and to identify ways for development. This is very valuable, and I'm very grateful for this. And very briefly, I'd like to thank all my colleagues who took part in the discussion at our discussion at our department, and everyone who for creating this atmosphere, as Geneva Regional loves to say, flourish 100 colors of metaphysics, anti-metaphysics, classical and post-classical thinking. And one comment I'd like to comment, made by Ilya Lvovich, about the post-classical theory of law. I think that will be an interesting task for the future, to try to understand what the post-classical approaches can be to the essence of law. And here the idea of Alexei Vyacheslamovich, that the metaphysical and anti-metaphysical approaches can be complemented with post-classical. I'm once again, I'm very grateful for the discussion. Thank you. And I make a very traditional conclusion that, in my opinion, the thesis corresponds to the requirements, and Natalia Sergeevna, in my opinion, deserves to be awarded the degree. Thank you. Thank you, Elena Vladimirovna. Thank you very much. Let us continue our session. Since we are working in the remote interactive access mode, do dissertation council members or the degree applicants any questions related to working in the remote access mode? If there are no questions, let us be asked my next question. Dear
У нас сейчас есть возможность перед началом голосования объявить перерыв для обсуждения результатов защиты при отключенном звуке трансляции. Но нужен ли перерыв? Как вы считаете? Нужен нам такой перерыв для обсуждения результатов защиты, или он не требуется ему?
Let's continue without a break. I think we don't need a break. I don't need this break.
Если обсуждение результатов защиты не требуется, то
if we don't need to
продолжаем
discuss the results, let us
заседание и переходим к
the
голосованию.
session and proceed to voting.
При этом мнение каждого члена диссертационного совета объявляется публично.
Given openly.
Игорь Юрьевич все-таки отсутствовал на большей части нашей дискуссии и не может голосовать, принять участие в голосовании. Поэтому прошу проверить, все мы ли друг друга слышим и видим. И ставлю вопрос о присуждении Наталье Сергеевне Васильевой, ученой степени кандидата юридических наук по специальности 12.0001 теории истории права и государства, истории учения о праве и государстве на открытое поименное голосование. Напоминаю, что решение диссертационного совета по вопросу присуждения ученой степени считается положительным, если за него проголосовало более половины, но не менее 3 членов диссертационного совета, участвовавших в заседании, согласно пункту 23 порядка присуждения степеней и так далее. Итак, Валентина Викторовна Лапаева, ваше мнение?
For awarding the degree, I vote for awarding the degree to Vasilyeva Natalia Sergeevna.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Илья Львович,
your opinion. I'm for all for
Алексей
awarding the degree. Alexei Vyacheslamovich.
Пропал звук. Звук пропал или слышно?
Can you hear us? Can you hear me?
Слышим.
Yes, now we can hear you. The thesis certainly deserves and I'm for awarding the degree. Thank you. And Sergei Fedorovich Udartsev. I am certainly for awarding the degree. The thesis is good. And thank you. And I would like to congratulate the author and the academic advisor. Thank you. And can I give my opinion on behalf of all the members? I would like to, Igor Yurievich, would like to speak. Not formally, but I am also for awarding the degree. Thank you. This is very important.
Мы приступаем к подсчету голосов и оглашению результатов голосования. И я, глубоко уважаемые коллеги, объявляю, что из 5 участвующих в голосовании членов диссертационного совета проголосовало за 5 человек, против нет, воздержалось нет. И таким образом решение о присуждении Наталье Сергеевне Васильевой ученой степени кандидата юридических наук по научной специальности 12.0001 теории истории права и государства, истории учения о праве и государстве принято. Уважаемые коллеги, в связи с тем, что наше заседание проводилось в режиме удаленного доступа, я должна выяснить, есть ли у членов диссертационного совета, у соискателя, у кого-либо, кто удаленно присутствовал, возможно, замечания по процедуре проведения заседания. Если замечаний нет, то я рада предоставить слово соискателю, заключительное, краткое заключительное слово. Пожалуйста.
Thank you. Let me thank my academic advisor for invaluable help and support. I'd like to thank the distinguished chairman and members of the Dissertation Council for their reviews, for participating in the Dissertation Council and for academic discussion. Also, I'd like to thank the Department of Theory and History of Law of St. Petersburg University, where my thesis was written, and curator of today's defense. All the guests and all the listeners, thank you for your attention, and most importantly, thank you for a high opinion of and for awarding me the academic degree of candidate of legal sciences.
Мы все, я думаю, что это общее мнение, от всей души поздравляем вас с замечательной защитой, замечательной диссертации, которую я написала, что даже превосходит требования, которые предъявляются к кандидатской диссертации, и желаем вам дальнейших творческих свершений. Таким образом, заседание объявляется закрытым. Я всех сердечно благодарю за участие. Рада была повидать вас, кого давно не видела, и мы все давно не видели друг друга. И прошу отключить сегодня прямую трансляцию.